Welcome to the NoJetStress Podcast, where we explore traveler wellbeing solutions for business and frequent flyers seeking to conquer jet lag and live healthier lives. I'm your host, Christopher Babayode, ex-flight attendant, traveler wellbeing advocate, nutritional therapist, and author. In this episode of the NoJetStress Podcast, I'm pleased to be talking to Dr. Martin Moore-Ede, a leading expert on circadian clocks and human health, a pioneer researcher on circadian clock regulation and disruption by light, with over 7,000 citations in the research literature, and also a former Harvard Medical School professor of over 20 years. He's also the founder of the Circadian Light Research Center. Dr. Martin, if I may call you that, welcome to the NoJetStress Podcast.
Pleased to join you, Chris.
Thank you so much. Where do I begin? I was excited to get this opportunity to speak to you, first and foremost, because as someone who's previously been a frequent flyer for over 20 years, I understood the difference my exposure to light made to me. I had conversations and interviews with people like Mickey Bear Clausen, who happens to run a popular time shifter app that lots of travelers use. And I've also interviewed a couple of people who have specific products that relate to making sure that people get a good, healthy diet of light. My perspective is that for 20 years, I've been out there and understanding how the absence or the presence of light influences my body as a cabin crew member for an airline for over 20 years. Your expertise is very specific. Could you give us a bit of a background about how you came into this work and the specifics of what the mission is for Circadian?
Well, I graduated out of Guy's Hospital Medical School in England as a physician and headed across the pond to do my surgical residency. I found myself working 36-hour shifts, basically then 12 hours off, back in for 36. And I became very much aware of the impact of long hours, fatigue, errors, just the state of constant sleepiness. And yet there were patterns to it, and that got me intrigued. And I took a detour out of my surgical internship to go and do a PhD at Harvard on the whole subject of circadian rhythms. This is before the circadian clock was identified, and it was a phenomenon. And I was advised not to go into that field. It was there's nothing much there. But I pursued it, and it turned out to be a very good choice because along the way I then joined the Harvard Medical School faculty as a professor, or led teams that discovered the clock in the human brain, the master circadian clock called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, discovered how it was synchronized by light, and then what all the ill health effects and poor impaired performance effects when you disrupt your circadian clocks. And that in turn, over the years, has led to looking at what are the solutions. My company, Circadian, advises major airlines around the world, particularly in their international flights, but also oil companies, manufacturing plants, anything that works 24/7, offshore rigs and the like, on how to stay healthy and productive when people are asked to work hours around the clock. It's not the natural pattern, obviously.
Yes.
We sort of sleep in our caves at night. That's where I, got into this. And along the way, we discovered the very precise nature of light. It's particularly certain wavelengths in light in the blue part of the spectrum that we need to control. And we basically also invented lights that protect our health and circadian rhythms. So I've been involved in also the development of new lighting technologies as well to address the problem.
A lot to unpack from what you've said there. One of the first things that I find particularly interesting, and it'd be interesting to hear how you view the next 5-10 years in terms of the circadian economy, is the fact that when I spoke to Mickey Bear Clausen, his prediction was in the next 5 to 10 years, we will see a massive growth and more of a focus on the circadian economy as such, because we are now a 24/7 society. And that will have massive impacts not on health, but also where investments go in terms of people who want to get ahead, stay productive. Would you agree?
Yes, I mean, I think the transition became to scale back in the 1980s, 1990s, when really a very large part of the economy switched to 24/7 operations. Some, of course, have always been 24/7. You can't get away from it. But yes, it's a seamless society. I do think that the awareness of circadian health has been lagging. And, that's been part of my mission, and including my recent book, The Light Doctor. I will, happy to plug on your podcast.
Please do.
But, The Light Doctor is a book that basically I wrote to deal with this whole issue. In other words, how do you manage light in your life? How do you get healthy? What lights to choose? What lights to avoid? And that's part of this education mission. Okay. So, yes, I think circadian health is a very big thing. All lights should be circadian. I led a team of 250 leading scientists, the ones who've done the most work in this area. And the conclusion is all lights should be circadian. In other words, they should provide blue-rich light during the day, and it should be other parts of the spectrum too, a full spectrum of light. But during the nighttime, you have to particularly remove the blue components. Light needs to be blue-free, and you need to sleep in the dark. Now, when you're traveling internationally, as you did for 20 years, the challenge is how to do that when the light environment is constantly changing, when the time zones are changing. And that's one of the most challenging things. And also for people who are working rotating shifts, who are constantly moving around the clock. So there's one set of guidance that's pretty straightforward for the person who is basically working daytime work, goes to bed in the late evening, wakes up in the morning, and so forth. That's a fairly straightforward set of advice, and really robust advice there is you can really define it very well. For people who are traveling, it's a more complicated thing because you've got to take into account the time it takes for your body to adapt to one time zone or another. So, if I make a quick trip to Australia, as I've done a few times, and literally turn around and I'm about a day on the ground and back again, then I'm not going to try to revert to Australian time on that trip. I'm going to protect myself from exposure to light that's going to disrupt me. But I mean, we probably ought to discuss for your viewers, I don't know how much they know about this, but how light interacts with the circadian clock.
Definitely would like to do that. One of the major distinctions that I like about Circadian specifically, and I mean your company Circadian, is my first interaction with Circadian, was through the fatigue management webinar that was put on. When my understanding and conversation about jet lag started, everything was lumped together. It was just jet lag. There was no distinction between the fatigue element and the circadian element. It was just seen as one. Making that distinction seems to be something that Circadian is well aware of and makes consistently in the kind of presentations and the materials that you have. And I think that's very important to know. For the layperson who might be tuning in to us, typically if you're traveling longitudinally, if you don't take too much of a latitude, you will almost inevitably have travel fatigue or some kind of fatigue. But if you go latitudinally, you're more often going to get fatigue as well as jet lag. And I think people, now that we have more ways of looking at things, making that distinction is really quite useful for people to understand. But back to the point that you made, yes, can I ask from the horse's mouth, so to speak, how would you describe the rudimentary elements of circadian health and their relationship to human health for the layperson to understand?
Well, we all have a circadian clock. In fact, I led the team at Harvard back in the 1980s that identified where it was in the human brain, a master circadian clock called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. It's linked to the eyes by a direct pathway called the retinal hypothalamic tract. Too much verbiage there, but essentially to specialized cells in the back of the retina of our eyes, and those cells contain a blue detecting pigment, in other words, something called melanopsin. And melanopsin has a peak sensitivity at a sky blue color. That's about 480 nanometers in the scale. Blue ranges from around in the low 400s up to 500, all the different colors of blue. But it's a particular color of blue, interestingly a sky blue color, that triggers receptors in the back of the eye that then signal whether it's day or night. Now, this all originated, by the way, quite intriguingly, down in the oceans when life began, many, many millions of years ago, back deep in the oceans. When sunlight penetrates the oceans, all the colors of the rainbow that normal sunlight is made out of, all the violets, blue, greens, yellow, oranges, reds, etc., most of those are absorbed by seawater except for this color blue, this sky blue color, which penetrates deep. So when the organisms were first evolving, life first began, day was blue and night was black. So we like to think about that. That's continued. So now, even though we have all the other colors of the rainbow in the sunlight that we see, it's still the blue is what is telling us it's the day, very sensitive to that blue. And so when we use light bulbs and light fixtures and light sources and computer screens that emit blue, and we use them in the evening hours or in the middle of the night, we're actually sending a signal that it's daytime. So the way the clock works is it's sensing blue during the evening, and if it senses blue later than expected, in other words, after sunset, then it starts shifting the clock to a westerly direction. In other words, if you're in Boston, it starts shifting you towards California. So on the other hand, if you see blue early in the morning, then in fact it shifts you from Boston towards London. In other words, in the opposite direction. So basically this nudging of our clock by light in the evening, pushing it back, delaying it, and light in the morning, advancing it, is the way that we normally keep in sync with our environment. So now, if we mess with that, before we get into travel, if we mess by that by using the standard LED lights that virtually 98% of lighting today sold is these LED lights that are based on a blue pump, we're actually telling our brains that it's still daytime, and we're shifting ourselves to later hours and delaying our sleep and disrupting our sleep. We're also, and as a result, you get quite sleep deprived, particularly if you have to get up early in the morning to go to work and do your other activities, go to school or whatever. So basically, that's one of the challenges. Now, some people are more sensitive than others, we should add, because some people who are evening types and morning types, in other words, some people get up early in the morning and fall asleep, relatively early in the evening, and other people who are hard to get up in the mornings and then are going great at midnight or 1 a.m., those people, turns out, interestingly, are most sensitive to this blue light, more sensitive to the blue light. Hence, what's happening is they get shifted. But if you put them all into a natural environment, you take them out, as was done by a professor, University of Colorado Boulder, take people out in the wild where there are no lights, they've got no cell phones, they've got no flashlights, they've got nothing, no source of electricity. Then, in fact, everybody adopts the same schedule. In other words, and they sleep better and so on. So it tells you something about this. So we're messing with it.
That's so interesting. Sorry, that is so interesting in as much as that. So basically, for what I'm hearing is this principle of entrainment.
Yes.
So when we take away all the artifice of the way we live currently, we will all naturally entrain back to what is basically natural. Is that correct?
That's right. And we get a very stable rhythm. So basically, you're healthier, your sleep is better, you feel better, all the rest of it when you're out in the natural world without the pollution, let's call it pollution, of artificial light, which is disrupting our normal patterns, right? So there are two sides of it, by the way, we should also point out. We tend to live indoors more and more. 93% or more of our time is spent indoors. And the problem is we are not getting the benefits of the full daylight. We're actually working in very dim conditions. You and I are both sitting indoors, and the light level in this room is 1,000 times less bright than it is outside. It's a sunny day outside. So we're actually living in twilight conditions during the day. So not enough light during the day is part of the problem. Too much light, particularly the blue light in the night, is a problem. It's both sides of the same equation. But when you're out in the natural world, you're out there, you're not sitting indoors, you're not behind windows that block UV, block infrared, block half the light spectrum, you're not sitting in a room that's dim with electric lighting, then in fact, you're going to be far healthier and you're far more robust. And so that's the ideal world, is that. Now,
Right.
we have to deal with living in the real world, right? Where we do have to do things indoors. And that's when we really have to think about the schedules of what we do. And then when we travel, we also have to be very thoughtful about what we do with the timing of sleep and the timing of bedroom.
I thought that was very interesting. One of my questions for you was going to be a personal anecdote of yours that you know of someone traveling and having to make an adjustment, and you came out straight from the gate with your trip down to Australia, which is something, it's kind of like a hack that a cabin crew member might use, not bothering to get onto local Australian time because you're not going to be there too long and you're going to come back a day later. So just stay on your time. Yeah.
You don't want a huge dose of sunlight at 3:00 in the morning on your body clock time and your home time, right? I mean, you're saying that. By the way, that shifting effect gets greater and greater the closer you get to the middle of the night. So in the evenings, the later that light that you see, right up to about 2:00 in the morning or somewhere right in the middle of that point, you get the maximum shift. And then it switches over to the maximum shift in the other direction. So a classic example, you're a flight attendant, you know this. Flying overnight from Boston to London, it's not a long flight, it's a 6-hour flight. And you tend to arrive at the time like 6:00 in the morning British time on some of those international flights. Well, now you've got 5 time zones different, so actually it is 1 a.m. your Boston time, where your body clock is. It's 1 a.m., which means you're getting a huge dose of light that's shifting you towards California. If you walk straight out of the bright sunlight, you get a huge dose of bright sunlight shifting you in the entirely opposite direction. So the idea is wear dark glasses, stay indoors, then go out for lunch in England and get in outside and get the benefit of daylight. It doesn't have to be bright sunlight. It can be a really typical British cloudy day. Still is way more light than you get. But that time of light is now going to help shift your clock in the direction you want to get you now on British time. Yeah. So again, the same policy is, when I fly to England, I've got to make a decision. Is this a 1-day trip or 2-day trip, or am I going to be there for a couple of weeks? Am I going to adjust or not adjust? And that's a question of what light do I want to see? Because if I stay indoors, I actually won't shift.
Because there's not enough light. There's not enough light to get you to shifting. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. I have this question for you. If you could go back in time and speak to Thomas Edison about the light bulb, what adjustments would you recommend that he take into consideration, if any?
Well, the very interesting is that Thomas Edison actually invented an incandescent type of light bulb, which is now banned. And just as of last year, 2023, it was banned in the US, earlier, I think, in Europe. And the incandescent light bulb was actually mimicking candlelight. Now, there's a very interesting thing there. The lights that we used to use in the old days, wood fires, candles, contain almost no blue, less than 1% blue content. And that means that those lights do not have such a disruptive effect. You can have the fire at night, candles at night, as in those classic Victorian, movies you see, right? They were walking around with holding candles. That's doing nothing to reset your clock because there's no blue content in that candlelight. So Thomas Edison actually invented a light bulb that mimicked candlelight to some extent. In other words, he showed instead of 1%, it was about 3 or 4% blue in a typical Edison light bulb, as opposed to 20% blue in some of these LED lights today. Huge.
So when did we make the shift to so much blue light?
First one was the fluorescent lights, and they came in really big scale in the 1970s, 1980s. Everyone, particularly in commercial properties, everyone switched over to fluorescents, and they contain as much blue as the modern-day LEDs. It's a question of what percent blue. We can show that you keep the percent blue below 2%, around 1%. And that, when I say percent blue, I mean how much of this blue in the sky blue range is there compared to all the light coming out of the light bulb. And in an LED bulb, it can be as high as 15, 20, even 25% is light that is this blue that is disruptive circadian clocks. So Thomas Edison didn't do such a bad job. It was really in the 1970s with the fluorescent lights coming in, and then we didn't introduce LEDs until 2014, thereabouts. In other words, we've only had them for about 10 years. It was about a 1% market share in 2014. It's a 90-plus market share today. It's basically the only thing you can buy because the incandescents and halogens are now banned. So what we've been working on is how to actually construct light bulbs. They can still be LEDs because you can engineer LEDs to produce any light spectrum you want. LEDs that actually are zero blue in content that you use during the evening hours and max blue in content that you want during the daytime hours. So that's really one of the types of solutions, as well as looking at other ways we can prevent you getting blue at the wrong times.
Okay, I'd like to come back to some more product-related things a bit later, but sticking with the specifics of circadian health, we tend to relate and understand it specifically, or in layman's terms, as the body clock. And I think there's more to circadian health than just the body clock. Can you give us an overview of what other things it might relate to that we should be aware of in terms of metabolism, hormones, things of that nature, or, in wellness and disease, that kind of conversation? Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. Well, first of all, we've talked so far only about a master pacemaker, the suprachiasmatic, or the SCN.
Right.
But there are millions, if not billions, of clocks in our body. Almost every cell in our body contains circadian clocks. And what matters even more is that they're all in sync with each other, because they can get out of sync. Now, with travel or jet lag or irregular schedules, you really are causing not only a mismatch between your environmental day-night and your master clock, but also a mismatch between all these individual clocks in the body. And what happens is when you disrupt that, you disrupt the hormones that are signaling, like melatonin is a key signaling hormone. It's released at night. Some people call it the sleep hormone. It's not the sleep hormone. It typically occurs during sleep. But if you give someone melatonin, it doesn't make them sleepy at normal levels and doses. But it is a cue that the body sends out, the clock sends out to all the cells of the body saying, hey, it's night outside. It's the night signal. And similarly, cortisol, which is a hormone produced by the adrenal cortical axis, and particularly by the adrenal gland, is a hormone that peaks just at dawn. And that, again, is saying, hey, it's time to wake up and get all the body processes ready for the day ahead. So we have these signals, and if you disrupt those signals and disrupt the synchrony of the clock, big things happen. So what happens? Well, people get more hungry, particularly under blue-rich light at night. They eat more. They eat twice as many snacks on the night shift, we find. They gain weight. The diabetes, glucose tolerance, insulin resistance all change. So we could just take you, Chris, and I could render you pre-diabetic in just a few hours by putting you in a room at night with LED lights, and your glucose tolerance will get out of whack, and your insulin resistance will go up, and you'll fail the glucose tolerance test, the one we take a sugar drink and measure the pattern in the blood of it as it goes up and down. All that I can destroy just in a night of giving you these LED lights we have today. Whereas if I give you lights that don't have blue in them, I can prevent that. No, it goes much further than that. Cardiovascular health, there's a lot of cardiovascular disease that's associated with circadian disruption. Immunological disorders of psychiatric depression, anxiety triggered by this. And also a number of cancers, particularly the endocrine-sensitive cancers. Some of the biggest causes of human death are like breast cancer in women, prostate cancer in men, colorectal cancer. And interestingly, as we introduce more and more blue-rich light into our evenings, our nights, and what's happening is that the rate of those cancers is rapidly increasing. It's going right up, and it's increasing quite rapidly these days.
This is a pet, not pet peeve, but yeah, it is a pet peeve of mine, and it relates specifically to aircraft. And I want to talk very briefly about aircraft lighting
Mhm.
because as cabin crew, if you get bunk rest, you come out the bunk, you need to go to the restroom, you open the door, and in your face you have blue light, you have blue light light up the restroom. You have the light being controlled centrally for people who may be on a different time zone, all that type of thing. Do you have any opinions about junk light on aircraft? And I asked, as at the top of the our conversation, you did mention that you do have some kind of advisory role for some airlines in relationship to the work that Circadian does.
Right. Well, essentially, yes. I mean, the trouble with lighting is people use it for aesthetic purposes. They do clever things in lighting. Some of the modern planes, change the color of lights. They're changing the color. Color is not what we're looking at. In other words, you can change color and do nothing good with the lights. So it's really the invisible content of light that you need to be aware of. Now, that's what is so critical here is how do we and the airlines don't tend to do that. Now, we've done a lot of work, and the airlines have got quite aware of the issues of fatigue. We've done a lot of work installing fatigue risk management systems in major airlines. Now, we work with the cabin crew and the international flights across American Airlines, just to give an example. We work with the pilots. We work with other major airlines. We work with ground crew who are working also extraordinary hours. And so we're working across the map, looking at systems to reduce fatigue. Now, light is part of that. And as you mentioned earlier on, fatigue is also related to things like the amount of sleep you're getting, which may or may not be related to light. It relates to the schedule you're working and how disruptive it is to your sleep-wake pattern. So, fatigue is a real killer. I mean, it's a big cause of major incidents and accidents and the like. So we do a lot of work on that sort of thing with the airlines. I think the timing of light exposure is quite critical in terms of pilot performance. We took a look at that and really saw that disruptive light in the middle of the night on international flights was quite disruptive to the pilot performance. So, there are a number of things that we're really been looking at in the airlines, but you certainly can, and you can model it. One of the things we've got is a fatigue risk model called CAS, or Circadian Alert Simulator, where we can predict very accurately as to who's getting fatigued, who's most likely to have an accident or an incident or make an error. You can actually predict these things, and as a result, you can use them to evaluate and design schedules. So there's a lot of things we do across airlines, as we do across almost every major industry that works 24/7 schedules.
At the time, I think it was in its infancy, and the science hadn't yet been developed to the extent that it is now. But I heard at one point in time, I think it was an Australian or an Oriental airline of some description that specifically looked at the biorhythms. That's such an old word. The
Yeah.
biorhythms of their pilots in order to assess suitability. And I forget the
Well, okay, let's get rid of astronomy is to astrology, right? As circadian rhythms are to biorhythms. All right.
okay.
All right. So basically, this whole business is by the date of your birth or the hour of your birth
Oh,
or whatever else,
yes.
that you can predict things. That's been disproven big time. Made 10 major
Okay.
studies showing has no whatsoever. So that is junk science, right? But there's a
Okay.
huge body, 20,000 scientific peer-reviewed articles on circadian science, and that's a different story altogether. That's very tangible and real.
Okay. So then, that being the case, would you would you say that airlines, so as cabin crew, I know that if I needed access to the occupational, what's it called now? The occupational hazard exposure that ionizing radiation poses to cabin crew, there is a log somewhere, and it can be looked into to see that I'm below whatever limitation is available. or before it gets to a point where you get derosted or something of that nature. My question really is there an uptake, would you know, from the kind of work that you've done, and considering you can advise on when people get tired, the people who are more at a risk or not? Is there anything that supports the idea that some airlines quite actually have that in place for pilots?
I don't think so much. I mean, certainly at the research level, yes. There are devices, little clip-on devices you can have that will continuously sample the light you're exposed to and track that. And basically that provides a very accurate determination of the exact, not only how much brightness, the intensity of the light you're seeing, but also the content of it. What's it made up of? What's it coming from? You can actually look at this thing and say, oh, he's under LED lights, and she's under fluorescent lights, and he's outside, outdoors. You can tell it just by looking at the pattern of how much blue and green and yellow and red is in the light, because each of these lights we have today have a significant pattern. And if you have people wearing those things, you can, in fact, track and then predict how well they're doing. And so now we do a lot of work in a way you can track just from the work schedule that someone has. We can enter that pattern, and then we can make certain assumptions about, they're going to sleep during their time off, when, because of their circadian clock, are they able to sleep or not able to sleep. And we can make those things. But the more information we have as an input, the more precisely can we say what the health impact is, the impact on their wellness, the impact on their performance. So the technology is there. I'm not personally aware of it being implemented broad scale, but there's been studies where these measurements have been made.
That is so interesting, because one of the things I talk about to my audience is the idea that if you are a frequent traveler, you may want to start to consider to develop your own toolkit of things that go with you to enable you to make these transitions based on the frequency of your travel and therefore look after your health. So I guess you're saying that you're not aware that it's something that's commercially available, but the technology does exist to be able to do that. It'd be interesting to see if that would develop.
The technology is available. Also, you need to make sure you classify yourself, and there are ways of doing this where you can determine the characteristics of your own circadian rhythms. So some people, as we've talked about, the morningness and eveningness, in other words, the larks and the owls, as it were, the types. But there are also people who are naturally short sleepers, partially long sleepers. One of the things is it's not only just the morning types and evening types of people. Some people are naturally nappers who will do very well napping in the middle of the day. And others really can only manage consolidate all their sleep in one consolidated chunk of sleep. And then we have the people who are also much more flexible in when they can sleep and when they can adjust themselves, and others who are much more rigid. And so basically, if you know who you are on those scales, it makes a big difference.
So is that to say that there's even more nuance in the so-called chronotypes than...
Exactly.
Okay, right.
Yeah, and what's interesting, these are actually genetically determined, these chronotypes. So now I wrote a book called The Complete Idiot's Guide to Getting a Good Night's Sleep. And my wife used to say, by the way, not clear whether it's written by an idiot or it's for idiots. But and so there's one of the places that I've laid it out. But basically, you can actually define your type. And if you know your type, it's a bit like Myers-Briggs. We all have those four combinations. If you know your type, then actually you can tailor more precisely your strategies to the type you are.
Can I ask you a question at that point, please? Yeah. So, for instance, as a getting to know one's chronotype, one of the easier questionnaires that you can get out there is the morning-evening type. Would you say that something like your book would go into more detail than that, or is that kind of like on par for getting an understanding of one's true type? Because I used to think that I was a morning type, but actually, according to my Aura ring, I'm more of a mid-morning type rather than a pure morning type.
There are many things between, right? In other words, It's a scale, it's a distribution. There are people who are extreme morning types. I happen to be one of them. I get up around 5 o'clock in the morning naturally, go to bed at 10, and there are others who are extreme, but most people are somewhere in between. So, and having some understanding where you are on each of these scales will make a difference in terms of actually the strategy. So knowing your own strategy is critical, and adapting your strategy to then your work life or your travel life. That's where the little bit of complexity comes in. But if you really use all that information, put it together, then it's a difference. Now, one of the key ways of regulating this, and actually, as I say, bringing everyone back into a more normal pattern, is if you actually adopt, as I talk about in my book, The Light Doctor, if you adopt a pattern of exposed to bright light, particularly in the morning hours, and then outdoor light, and get outside in the early morning hours is a particularly good thing, or the mid-morning hours. Then if you do that, and you also make sure you're free of blue during the evening, and you sleep in darkness, pitch darkness at night, then what will happen is actually everybody starts to become similar to each other. It's
Right.
really, and so you can actually minimize those differences by following that core pattern. Now, that's only really possible if you're located in one location and are, but that's basically part of it. But I encourage your readers, as we wrap up here, to take a look at The Light Doctor. It really explains in very understandable terms about light, how important it is, and what happens when we don't get enough sunlight, what happens when we use LED lights, particularly in the evening hours, what happens if you sleep with the lights on, but also how can you avoid those things, and what are some of the products. And I also write a Substack column, which every 2 weeks, I'm bringing this information into more detail every 2 weeks, what new products, what new solutions are available. And
So please give us your socials so that we know where we can go to get more information. And then we'll just wrap up with one more question, and then I'll have to let you go.
My websites are thelightdoctor.com. That's where you get the book. Circadianlight.org, where you get information on all the solutions that are out there. And then Substack, Martin Moore-Ede. You can search for Substack, Martin Moore-Ede, and you'll find that, The Light Doctor, there, a Substack. But I'll provide you that so you can put it into the chat feed of your podcast.
That's perfect. One more question, and it's a very simple one. What is your favorite destination around the world, and why?
Well, that's actually fairly easy. It's flying into the UK. That's where I was born.
I'm sorry, I do not accept that because I can detect the British accent, so you cannot choose home. I'm sorry.
Okay, that's an easy one. Oh, okay. Yes. I mean, I think Singapore is fascinating. I think that place, that's one of my favorite places. Yeah.
Okay, that's lovely. Thank you so much for your time. I'd love to have you come back on the NoJetStress podcast in the future, and I hope to speak to you soon. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Martin Moore-Ede.
Thank you, Chris.